My dad tells me there's a photograph, sadly lost to history, taken of Lieutenant Sergeant Albert Gambian of the Welsh Regiment, British Army, who had been invited from colonial India in 1919 to compete in an athletics carnival on the grounds of Buckingham Palace, held as part of the celebrations commemorating the end of the First World War. Your Excellencies, it has been over 100 years since anyone from the House of Windsor or any of their vice-regal representatives had the Gambians over for a visit. And I'm very thankful for the invitation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. I've travelled here today from Bidjigal country in Sydney South, and I acknowledge the Camaragal people on whose land we are privileged to meet. I pay my respects to elders and ancestors of Bidjigal and Camaragal both. Now, I have a confession. I am a bleeding heart, lefty, greenie trade unionist. I have no professional qualifications in psychology or psychiatry, and if you told me a year ago that I'd be standing in this magnificent place today, in this job, I would have either been confused or amused, or more likely both. I spent most of my life representing workers in the trade union movement, and more recently I have championed conservation and climate action. As a union official in the banking industry, I worked with people whose most pressing workplace issue was psychological safety. At the time, of course, we didn't call it that. For my members, it presented as excessive workloads, long hours, and sometimes, all too often, bullying and harassment. We had one member who was subjected to 19 armed hold-ups. 19. She had soldiered on for the first 18, but when she couldn't work after the 19th, her employer's response was to hire a private investigator to stake out her house and follow her on public transport in order to prove that she was faking her injury. For all the talk of concern for mental well-being, all the morning teas and encouraging posters in lunchrooms, for all the emails and assertions of care, there is no program or deep breathing exercise that is a substitute for bullet-resistant glass. The installation of that bullet-resistant glass that came years later after legal action by the union turned out to actually be a powerful action towards mental health. I started as Chief Executive at the Nature Conservation Council 33 days before those terrible bushfires in 2019 and 2020. I remember, you probably do too, stepping outside my house and breathing the thick smoke that was blanketing much of suburban Sydney. I remember that feeling of deep despair that for all the painstaking trouble my wife Kate and I go to in order to keep our kids safe, the car seats, the child safety latches, the baby monitors, I couldn't keep my little girls safe from the air. I remember travelling to the far west, to Tolano Station, on the unsealed road between Pooncarie and Menindee, along the dry riverbank bed of the Darling Barker, and seeing the smoke haze from that far away in the east. A community that had lived with the worst drought in recorded history and just months earlier had witnessed the deaths of millions of fish from stagnated water that left an intolerable stench in their towns. I heard stories of people who had lost hope that anything could be better, of livelihoods and families destroyed. I heard stories of wasted lives and needless deaths. And I heard stories of resilience, of communities coming together to overcome the most dire of circumstances. I have spent my entire working life championing justice and helping people find their voices. And it's hard to think of an issue that is more core to justice than mental health and well-being, and the systems and structures that influence it. It's an honour to be trusted with the responsibility of this job. I love the famous words of the Brazilian priest Dom Helder Câmara. When I feed the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor are hungry, they call me a communist. My leadership of Australians for Mental Health will be focused on three things: bringing people together for shared purpose, helping people find their voice and amplify their stories, and challenging the norms, attitudes, behaviours, structures that impede the ability of Australians to live their best, mentally healthy lives. I'm so pleased you could all make it this afternoon, and you honour us with your presence. But this is a bit of a ragtag group. In our number today, we have a few people who've been awarded Australian honours, OAMs and AOs of very admirable standing, and we have a few who've been tossed out of some of Sydney's dodgiest bars and pubs, some with me. We have We have captains of industry, trade union bosses, advertising gurus, community advocates, sports people, and even the odd clinician. We have multimillionaires and people who've lived rough on Sydney streets. We come from all sorts of experiences. We see the world through as many perspectives as there are faces in this room. We come from a range of partisan traditions. We observe a variety of faiths and some none. And after a few wines later, no doubt, we may yet descend into some heated debates about the issues of the day. Who's for a stage 3 tax cut? But if you're standing here today, you probably agree that what we are doing to manage Australia's mental health is not working. And perhaps more importantly, you're standing here today because you want to do something about it. At Australians for Mental Health, we think nothing short of a complete overhaul of the way Australia thinks and acts on mental health and wellbeing is what is needed. We believe we need to understand the ways in which we organise ourselves as a society that supports good mental health and wellbeing and do more of it. And we need to be honest with ourselves about what we have come to accept as normal and routine, but which is unnecessarily causing mental harm. There's a great many ideas and even differences of opinion on what the right response is, but there are some fundamental ideas that I think we can all coalesce around. How do we ensure that every Australian has access to the right kind of care, when and where they need it, at a price they can afford? We may never agree on what to fund, but we can all agree how funding decisions should be made. That is, to support those interventions with a sound evidence base. And can we agree those programs need to be funded to work, not on a budget or political timeline, but on a timeline that maximises the likelihood of success? Our National Mental Health Monitor, which His Excellency referred to earlier, last year told us that Australians cite work as their #1 source of mental health pressure. How do we change work so that it stops making us sick? And how do we ensure mentally unhealthy workplaces don't lead to mentally unhealthy homes? How do we design our schools to put mental health at the centre of how we teach our kids? How do we systematically identify their mental health needs and then respond to those needs with early intervention treatments and adjustments to the way we design our teaching methods? And speaking of kids, in a country where over 30% of us have experienced emotional abuse in our childhoods, nearly 40% of us were exposed to domestic violence, over 28% of us experienced sexual abuse, and 9% of us experienced neglect, how do we turn the fight to end child maltreatment into a fight to intervene in intergenerational trauma and mental harm? How do we design government so that mental health and wellbeing sits at the heart of how decisions are made, up there as important as the economy and national security? Just this week we submitted our suggestions to the federal government ahead of this year's budget. Our proposals are modestly priced, but represent important structural change. To mandate the government decisions are assessed for their impact on mental health and wellbeing so that avoidable tragedies like robo-debt can never happen again. To adopt a whole-of-government approach to mental health and wellbeing where every department and agency identifies and leverages its opportunities to support mental health within its sphere of control and acts to mitigate those areas that run the risk of causing avoidable mental harm. To create a set of national targets for mental health and wellbeing, a North Star for what good looks like, alongside a set of national mental health and wellbeing principles to act as a compass for getting there. And to create a Mental Health and Wellbeing Commissioner in the Australian Human Rights Commission to hold government to account for its actions. This change is urgently necessary. As His Excellency mentioned earlier, 1 in 3 of us describe ourselves as having poor or very poor mental health. Almost 2 in 5 of us describe ourselves as lonely. And the statistics are worse still for our younger people. 10 years of well-meaning suicide prevention actions have seen the problem get worse and not better. We don't have time for another report or more tinkering around the edges. We can't wait 10 more years. We need a crisis response that befits the crisis we are in. Australians for Mental Health exists solely to drive this reform. We're doing it in 3 ways. Bringing people together in their own communities to find common ground and create a powerful voice for concrete local changes. Bringing together a national alliance of civil society organisations from faith groups to sporting clubs, environmental groups, trade unions and the social service sector to band together for the structural change we all want and need. And to influence the public debate from the kitchen table to the cabinet table, turning a private shame into a shared public challenge. Thank you once again for being here. You're here because you want change, and the fact is we need you. We need partners and we need friends. We need your enthusiasm, we need your wisdom, we need your hard work, and we need your money. And whatever of those you have in mind to give, and for whatever of those you have in mind to give, we need you to times it by 3. Because in Australia, every mind matters. Thank you.